Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Well, Mama don't allow no modern houses going on. Mama don't allow no modern houses going on. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna love my modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no modern houses going on.
Welcome to US Modernist Radio. Join George Smart and Frank King as they talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Show your support for the show by going to patreon.com/US Modernist Radio for all kinds of fun incentives to shamelessly empty your wallet. Today, US Modernist Radio welcomes architect Milton Small III and his dad's superfan, blogger and digital mapmaker John Morris. And now, coming to you from Raleigh, North Carolina, George Smart and Frank King.
Welcome, everybody. I'm George Smart along with Frank King. Hey, Frank.
Hey.
He's waking up, folks.
I'm sorry. I'm still singing that song.
It's been just over 6 months since Frank Gehry's famous press conference in Spain. Irritated by a journalist's challenge to the practicality of his designs, Gehry gave the room a huge middle finger and declared that 98% of what gets built today is, well, the Spanish word for it is merdre. So, Frank Gehry, if you're listening, and of course we know you are, we'd love to have you on the show to discover what 2% of architecture you think is not merdre. US Modernist Radio is brought to you by modboxusa.com. Turn your mailbox into a modbox with one of Modbox USA's colorful, stylish, retro, mid-century, modern mailboxes that complement your home's modern aesthetic and turns mail time into party time. Woo! See one now at modboxusa.com. And by Sarah Sonk. When it's time to sell your modernist home, listing on MLS alone isn't enough. Reach out to an agent who loves modernist houses with the expertise, experience, and track record to close your deal. She's Sarah Sonk, 919-601-7339. And now here's Frank with the Modernist News.
Alrighty, Dateline, Spokane, Washington. Here is the ultimate modernist home, straight out of the mid-century and right back from the Cold War. Price chopper marked down from $120 million to a measly $1.25 million. The original owners, can you guess? The U.S. Air Force. They moved out, took tons of equipment, including 3 ICBMs. It's a Cold War Titan missile base, one of only 6 built in the U.S. As you might imagine, not many neighbors. Who wants to live next to a bullseye during the Cold War? Is on sale in Adams County, 90 miles west of Spokane. Buy it and be prepared for the zombie apocalypse. No windows to wash. Nobody cares if you mow the lawn, and the roof won't leak, or criminy, I hope it wouldn't. The installation is the best possible. Now, like a modernist home, lots of circle, cylinders and domes, they're the norm because they were the best at withstanding pressures from near impacts of nuclear weapons. They were designed to guard against Soviet nukes, of course, so they're probably safe from, let's say, near asteroid impacts. After you're in there, a few things to keep in mind. Do not lock yourself out. The doors weigh 3 tons and are meant to lock really, really well. And be very careful pushing any buttons. The ICBMs are supposed to be gone, but you can never be too sure. And that oh-so-tempting button that you think says lunch actually says launch. And pushing it may result in it being your last meal. And finally, what used to be an industrial water tank in rural southeast England is now a breezy private home. The conversion, completed for the English visual artist Dinos Chapman and his family, embeds spacious living quarters between the original concrete slabs and columned framework. The structure may no longer hold 500,000 gallons of water like it used to, but it does maintain its aquatic roots via an ultra-zen 82-foot-long courtyard pool, which conveniently also serves as a lovely light well well, now there is a great idea for a corridor of 5 bedrooms. How about that? You can repurpose a reservoir that used to hold hundreds of thousands of gallons of water into a luxury modernist dwelling and sell it for millions. Are you listening, architects in California?
Oh,
All right, let's go with our guest today. John Morris is a usability engineer at Procured Health in Chicago. He describes his day job as expertise and passion at the point at which people and technology meet. That sounds very impressive, John. But at night...
Thank you. It's just sort of a fancy way of saying, let's make the software we use on a daily basis a little easier to use.
Wow, what a concept. And by night, like Batman, he's an avid archivist and a super fan of an architect named Milton Small Jr. Every major town has an architect like Milton Small Jr., someone who becomes a hometown hero for his adventurous modernist buildings and homes. Small was one of these in Raleigh, North Carolina. His homes and office buildings were way ahead of their time, and we'll hear from John why they are important. Although Small died in the early 90s, his firm lived on through our next guest, Small's son, Milton Small III, managing principal of Small Kane Architects since 1973. Milton graduated from NC State School of Design in 1966, just when his dad's career was hitting its peak. The firm has in recent years been the go-to architects for law firm practices, specialty university buildings, and hospitals. Small's firm also recently renovated a well-known George Matsumoto office building in downtown Raleigh, which is now owned by the Junior League. So welcome, John and Milton. Thanks for coming.
glad to be here.
Very glad to be here as well. Thank you, George.
This is also significant because Frank King grew up in a Milton Small house, and he has some questions for Milton III here we're going to get to a little bit later on. But let's start off a bit. Tell us, John, about how did you start this interest in modernist buildings? And I know you had a blog called Goodnight Raleigh, which is still going, but how did that all come about?
Well, the blog started off as a way for me to explore the city. I had just moved to Raleigh a little bit earlier, and taking photos sort of encouraged me to get out, learn about my new city, learn the history and the architecture and the little hidden things that were there. And regarding my interest in architecture, and specifically modernist architecture, it was really the office building for Milton Small's firm on Brooks Avenue near Hillsborough Street. I was near where I lived for many, many years, and I had just walked by and noticed, there was this koi pond underneath a building that was raised up, and it was really unusual. And the more I walked by, the more I became curious, and of course I took some photos, and really that office building is what started my entire adventure of being interested in architecture and learning about it, as well as the architect who designed it, Milton Small Jr.
So let's tell you, folks, a little bit about Milton Small Jr. Milton Small was born in Oklahoma and relocated to North Carolina in 1948 to be the chief designer for William Dietrich, at the time Raleigh's largest architecture firm. While there, he designed the 1947 Carolina Country Club, the first modernist country club building in the country. And then he left in 1949 to start his own firm. Small is noted for designing Carter Stadium, which is now Carter Finley Stadium, the North Carolina State University Student Center, St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Durham, Durham's Home Security Life Building, and many modernist houses. So, Milton, you grew up in a house your dad designed, right?
Of course.
And where was it in town?
On Lake Boone Trail.
And this, at the time, was pretty daring, wasn't
it? We didn't think anything of it. Everything was modern.
It was just where you grew up.
That's right.
So you thought all houses were like this?
Sure.
So describe for our listeners what the house was like and where your dad drew some of his inspiration.
Well, the house on Lake Boone is just a large, well, not too large, probably about 3,000 square feet on one floor, with a huge porch across the front and one big room with the living room, dining room, and kitchen all in one spot. And that's just pretty normal.
Okay. So your dad he spent some time in Chicago, right? And did he study with Mies van der Rohe?
He did. He did graduate work with Mies. And I think what I remember about him telling me in his master's program, they did a one-bedroom house for a semester because Mies said he could teach them everything he knew about architecture in a one-bedroom house.
Did that happen? Did he get the great gift from Mies in one semester?
Well, I think he got most of it.
So when he came to North Carolina, he really started getting clients who were interested in the same kind of modernist design, which is pretty unusual for North Carolina, particularly then.
Well, he actually came with Henry Kampafner when he came to be the dean at NC State. Dietrich wanted to know, he needed a new architect, another architect, and so Henry Kampafner suggested my father. So he came to town and started working for him, and then I guess I don't know exactly how it happened, he met the Rothstein brothers who owned Southeastern Radio, which the building is still standing today, although it's in pretty decrepit shape on Hillsborough Street, but he did a house for all three brothers.
And those houses are still in pretty great shape.
They're in pretty good shape.
Yeah.
One is in excellent shape.
Okay. So you were how old at the time?
Well, see, I was born in 43, so in the mid-50s I was 16.
Okay.
14.
And at the time, your dad was also involved in doing some big buildings in town.
I guess he had been on the planning commission for a while, and he did the city hall. I'm not trying to figure out which one was the first ones of the larger buildings. The office building that we still own and still use, although we don't our company is not in that building,
yes.
Was built in 1966.
Okay.
And that's about the time when he did the Northwestern Mutual building on Glenwood Avenue, which is as I'm sure we'll talk about that some more later.
Yes.
Those were two of the early buildings. I'm kind of at a blank now.
And he was involved with what became the Capital Bank building downtown? Didn't he do the interiors for that in conjunction with another firm?
He was the bank's architect.
Okay.
And worked with the New York architects. I can't remember their name now. They did all high rises.
Yes.
And that was in the early 60s.
Yeah, I can remember when that bank building went up, and it was very sleek looking and black, and everybody had a very strong opinion about it in downtown Raleigh. But it was the go-to place. Everyone wanted to have their parties there and their weddings and their receptions, and political campaigns got kicked off there. I mean, it was really something for this area.
Well, it was a large banking hall.
Yes.
Just one whole floor, 2 stories high.
Yes.
And that's a very nice building.
I spoke with Jim Brandt a few years ago, who's not with us anymore. He was the firm's superintendent when your dad and modernist builder Frank Walzer went into business to develop small modern houses in the mid to late 50s. They couldn't sell very many, so only a few got built. But coincidentally, one of those houses was Frank's childhood home. Frank, I know you want to ask some questions of Milton because it had some very interesting features.
Yes, and by the way, I dearly love that house, Milton. It's I didn't know at the time, but I was a child. The entire back of the house, almost entirely, is glass. Which makes sense. Takes advantage of because we had a view to the woods, and then Anderson Drive and Six Forks were obscured by all the pine trees, so it was lovely. The interesting feature, I think, was that they put the water heater. It was about half size of a normal water heater over the stove in the kitchen not in a cabinet that you could open, but one that was actually screwed shut. And I remember that vividly because I was awakened in the middle of the night one night, came out into the living area, and there's my dad standing ankle deep in the water that the water heater had blown. And, it took an entire crew to get it open, to get it out. And then we put the replacement water heater in the storage room out off the garage where it probably would have belonged. But other than the water heater, I was crazy about that house. I'll tell you whose house I liked better was Jim Brandt's house. because his son Robert and I were a year apart in age. And I was just, I'd never been in a house like it. It was the one, it's down on the creek side of Drury Lane. It had the sort of Quonset hut sort of looking roof pieces.
Barrel vaults.
Barrel vault concrete roof.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is no longer there.
The house is there.
The house is there, but
it has a pitch roof on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is silly. I wish they hadn't have done that.
Frank, the whole thing about the house you grew up in, it was one of the early prefab houses, and they got every square inch in functional space. And I'm sure that hot water heater up there probably was a fire suppression unit, so you could dump the water on the stove.
Well, and as a matter of fact, it was over the fireplace on the other side, which, by the way, my dad had never lived in a house with a fireplace. So when we moved in, he thought, well, fireplace, got to make a fire. Had never heard the word damper. So he built a fire in the fireplace, didn't open the damper. We were driven from the home in the first few hours we were there by the fire that my dad built in the house, and it subsequently filled with smoke. The Brandt house, by the way, was built on pilings, I think, because Robert and I used to play underneath the house. There was no crawl space. It was a great place for kids to play with with Tonka trucks and move dirt here and there. And it was just I'd never seen anything. I don't think I've seen anything since quite like that house. And I'm sorry they ruined the roof. There was one next door also, a little more traditional, but again with quite a bit of glass, and the first spiral staircase I'd ever seen in the house. And the bedrooms were very similar to the ones in Jim Brandt's house. I wonder if he had some influence over whoever designed and built that house. But yeah, I'm a big fan, obviously having grown up in the style.
Yeah, he may have had some influence on that one. I don't know specifically, but that house is built on a fairly steep slope down towards the creek, and you don't want to build foundation walls as deep as they do today. That was very expensive.
What I've discovered, Milton, is over time there are spots in Drury Hills back in the day, off West Drury and East Drury Lane, that were not at the time, I guess, considered buildable. And now there are whole neighborhoods, little mini neighborhoods in these spots where I think what they've done is they've built them again on pilings up at least a floor with like they do at the beach with the breakaway walls down below in case Crabtree decides to, as it does occasionally, jump it to banks. So as the property values inside the Beltline went up, places where I suppose they didn't think were buildable in the past, there are now houses there. So,
well, we do have flood lines now, which we didn't back then. You could do pretty much anything in the 50s.
Yeah, you could build houses over streams.
Sure.
You could build bridges over things.
Such as the Wade Lewis house.
Yes. There's a house in downtown Raleigh that is over the stream, over the little creek, or
the Lewis house.
Yeah.
It spans one wing spans the creek.
Okay. And they don't let you do that anymore.
You can do it, but
it takes a lot of effort.
Takes a lot of money.
So, John Morris, when you started Goodnight Raleigh and were inspired by the Milton Small office, you started exploring a lot of other Milton Small Jr. buildings and really got to be a fan. So tell us about your explorations.
Sure. Something sort of tying back to the conversation earlier about some of his earlier commissions, something that's interesting and a little bit overlooked was one of his earliest designs was Burlington Labs, the nuclear facility at NC State, which I believe was designed in 1950. And it's pretty noteworthy because it was the first, according to NC State, it was the first nuclear reactor that was devoted just to peacetime activities in an educational program. So it was, it wasn't built for war, it wasn't built for anything else. It was for education and learning. And, in 1950, that was some pretty cutting-edge stuff. And he designed that building among several others at NC State between the 1950s and 1960s. So a lot of the exploration sort of started there around the office building, around NC State, and branched outward. And ever since, it's been sort of a side interest of mine to try and find and document as many as I can, because unfortunately a lot of them are going fast. I think my favorite collection of them is of buildings that he designed is a real treasure, and it's kind of hidden. It's Mount Olive Junior College, although now I believe it's known as University of Mount Olive. But it's an entire college campus that at the time was mostly designed by Milton Small Jr. And it's a lovely campus. It has some beautiful buildings, rolling green hills and paths, and it's really a treat to see and experience. So I would encourage your listeners to visit that college if they're in North Carolina and want to experience some beautifully designed architecture by Milton Small.
And if you're in town in Mount Olive, make sure to pick up some pickles while you're down there, because they're one of the world's centers for pickles and olives and other things you put in brine. So tell us about the 1962 Northwestern Mutual building, John. You wrote about that in 2008, and that building seems to have a real story.
Yeah, this one's kind of painful for me. That was around the time 2008. That was whenever I'd started learning more and more about who Milton Small was as an architect and some of his other works. And I really fell in love with the insurance building there, the Northwestern Mutual Insurance building there in Glenwood, and seeing that sort of cemented and my admiration for his work. And oddly enough, I came to know it rather intimately a little bit later when I had broke my collarbone in a bicycle accident.
Oh.
And was going there quite frequently when it was the Raleigh Orthopedic Clinic. So I got to spend a lot of time there over the course of several months on the inside as well as the out. And in a strange twist of fate, I relocated to Chicago a couple of years ago. And an odd story that I heard from Milton III not long before I came here was there was a twin. There was another building that was the same design and looked the same as the building in Raleigh here in Chicago. So for a long time, it was my mission to find it. Didn't have an address. Googling the results, couldn't find anything, and I eventually was able to locate it via some blueprints that I had scans of from the plans. And in a tragic twist of fate, I found out that the building was demolished shortly before I moved here, so I was unable to see it. It was a pretty heartbreaking moment, especially, as much as I had come to know the one there in Raleigh, and then in the double twist of fate, the future and what's going on with the building there. So it's an interesting story. And Milton, correct me if I'm wrong, but as I recall it, he was hired to design the building there in Raleigh, and Northwestern loved the building so much that they wanted him to build another one that looked just like it for their headquarters in Chicago. Am I telling that story right?
That's pretty much correct. They actually did the first building in Raleigh for Northwestern, and they liked it so much that they doubled the size of it 5 years later in 1970.
Oh, wow.
And during that period is when, somewhere around 1970, I think, is when they built the Chicago building, which was featured in I think, New York Times article on new office building design. But that I never did see it, and I do know that it had been destroyed.
So, Milton, for the building here in Raleigh, describe this building for our listeners, because it really is a unique building for anywhere.
Well, it just doesn't seem unique to me because Dad always used overhangs to protect the walls of a building. And in this case, he took the southern porch and wrapped it completely around an office building, which left a large walkway, shaded everything from every side, and let the glass be protected. So you really didn't have to have curtains on it. So everybody inside, which was a totally flexible space, had access to the outside, and it was an open office, except for some executive offices in the front.
This porch, this was not just something nominal. This is a huge porch.
It's a huge porch that protects the inside of the building. And then that sits on a pedestal up out of the ground, and then there is a basement area which became large. All of that, again, the building was doubled in size 5 years after it was first built. And it just fits into its site so well, and sort of is the synthesis of Southern architecture in a contemporary mode.
But if you walk into the building, as I did last year, it really has the feeling of being in a Chicago skyscraper. And you can imagine yourself being on the 35th floor of something over Wacker Drive, and it would have the same kind of vibe.
True.
That's one of the reasons that I'm most drawn to his architecture is there's something really special about having such expansive use of windows, of glass, so you're more connected to the outside. And though I haven't read many, if any actually, of any writings or essays of Milton Small, something I've learned throughout the years of hunting down his buildings and photographing them, is that it took a lot of effort to sort of connect people inside the building to the outside. And there are many examples throughout the mid-century of office buildings that would make expansive use of windows and glass, but it didn't always work out so well because of bright sunlight. And like Milton said, they'd always have to have curtains, which sort of defeated the purpose. And it's really interesting that he was able to create these designs that had floor-to-ceiling windows and really allowed you to be connected to the outside, but also taking the environmental considerations of you're not going to get burned in the summer from the sunlight, going in. There's going to be shade, and so it's a lot of careful thought to details like that. That's really amazing about his work.
Well, I got to tell you guys, I just realized that my first job out of college in 1980 was for Unigard Insurance Group, and I trained with Unigard in that building.
That's right. That is Unigard. That when I was trying to find it down, that's right. The name changed to Unigard, I believe, after it was built. That's right. What do you remember about the inside? Do you remember much about whenever you were in training there?
Yes, I remember the air conditioning went down in those executives' offices on the front part of the building. The windows don't open, so it was a little warm on the front side of the building when the air conditioning went out. I do also remember the I guess it wouldn't be called a basement. Would that be the technical term? That's where the claims department was downstairs.
Lower level.
Which opened onto a patio. The lower level, yeah, opened onto a lovely patio. And you're right. The thing that I didn't realize at the time was all that glass, no curtains, nobody got sunburned. So the way... Just the clever way it was designed to fit into the in the landscape, I guess gave it the shade it needed, so you didn't get fried if you happened to be in one of the executive offices up front.
Yeah, and I worked in the building too, briefly, in 1987 or 1988. At that point, the basement had not been expanded yet; it was just sort of up against the side. But you looked out on this beautiful courtyard. So it's been several incarnations. It's been an insurance company, and then it's been another insurance company, and then an orthopedic clinic, and there have been various businesses on the bottom floor. Milton, what is its status now? I mean, where is it headed at the moment?
Well, just to back up a bit, to take that idea of what Northwestern was designed,
yes.
There's another building, John, I know you know this one, the AATCC building in the Research Triangle Park.
Yep, I certainly do. I have photographed, and that is one of my top favorites. That one by his, yes, absolutely.
That is the same concept, except the perimeter, instead of being shaded and open air, it's all the perimeter of that building in the park is all corridor.
Okay.
And all the people are inside. Again, where they're in their offices, they don't have to have curtains or anything other than for any privacy. But it's the very same concept, sitting on a pedestal, a large pad, and that building is loved by its occupants today, and it's probably going to be destroyed in the next 25 years when the park expands and becomes a huge urban complex out there.
Well, it gives us some time to try to do something with it.
That's right.
So tell us more about the Glenwood Avenue building. What's happening with that?
Well, my understanding is the owner, a family that owns the building, is they don't have a tenant for it, and they have offers of It's very valuable real estate in Raleigh and in the car, one of the best rental corridors in town. And it's going to go the way of, unquote, progress.
So it'll get torn down, you think, and rebuilt?
Yes, unless a patron comes along and wants to, can make it fit their needs.
Okay. And it's a building that, besides having this wraparound porch and this great sort of vibe on the inside, it's also got a lot of parking, as I recall. I mean, it's got several hundred spaces in the back.
Well, that's because it's a big building.
I mean, I could see it being some sort of fabulous restaurant or, athletic center or something like that, as well as being an office building, because those windows are just extraordinary.
Well, it depends on who pays the highest rate.
Well, and I got to tell you guys, again, on the commenting, I think George is right. When I in retrospect, having seen many episodes of Mad Men, walking into that building wasn't like walking into a building in the South. It was more, as George said, like walking into a building in Chicago or some major metropolitan area. One quick story on Unigard: they are a Seattle-based company, and we were going to on the lovely back patio. One of the first things that we were going to do after I got there was have a pig picking, and they sent a note to Seattle, could we have budget money for a pig picking? And the folks in Seattle wrote back, what exactly is a pig picking? They had never heard the, that was back before, the homogenization of the population of the United States. So we did, in fact, by the way, on that lovely patio, have our pig picking.
Well, John, you have taken this original project of Goodnight Raleigh and expanded into a couple of other different things, one of which is called Chicago Patterns, which I just found fascinating project. Tell us about that.
Sure. Chicago Patterns is, I didn't want to take the exact idea of Goodnight Raleigh and just sort of copy it and turn it into something here in Chicago. I thought that Goodnight Raleigh was something special on its own, and it should sort of be its thing. And I didn't want to just sort of copy the image. So Chicago Patterns is something similar to where it examines buildings and architecture and how they fit into the environment and the neighborhood. And it sort of does the same thing. It tells stories, draws awareness to preservation issues. But I'm a little sad to say it doesn't focus on modernism quite as much as I'd like, because here, one of the things I really miss about Raleigh is a lot of the modernist architecture is closer to the city center. And here in Chicago, most of the modernist architecture is further out in the suburbs. So sort of the idea of what Chicago Patterns is something similar, just highlighting interesting buildings and, making sure people are aware of the importance of the built environment around them.
How does that work on the website? Do people go and they can search for a specific building or a landmark?
Yeah, there's actually two parts to that project. There's Chicago Patterns, which is kind of closer to Goodnight Raleigh, where it's articles and stories about buildings and goes into depth and detail. And I have a separate related project called Chicago Architecture Data, and that is more of a database. It's kind of similar to your project, George, and it's a searchable database. I think right now we've got about 13,000 buildings, and we're going to be moving into mid-century here in a few months. Right now, it kind of stops at the Art Deco era around the 1940s. But once we get that tidied up, then we're going to move on to mid-century, and it's buildings that you can search by neighborhood, search by architectural style, so you can look at all the Art Deco buildings and that sort of thing. And I've got plans to expand that to other cities, but I'll come back and chat with you once that happens.
Well, this is no small project. Chicago Architecture Data has been featured in Fast Company and Curb Chicago, which called it the Wikipedia for building lovers, as well as articles in Architect Magazine and Arch Daily. So it's really a good thing you're doing, John. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. Raleigh's on my list. I have thousands of photos and information. It's just, the with a full-time job, it's, more or less finding time to fit everything in. And I still, even though I don't write as much as I used to, I still help out with Goodnight Raleigh and do a lot of, I'm still very active and very involved maintaining a social media presence, helping out with research and articles. So have a lot to manage, but I would really, what I'd like to do is carry the same over for Raleigh and catalog all the beautiful modernist buildings that are there.
So, John and Milton, a question for you both. In most every major city, there's somebody like Milton's dad, who was very active in the 50s and 60s, who built these wild and crazy buildings that a lot of people really love and would like to see preserved. If our listeners are out there and they have somebody that they would like to see their buildings last, what can they do to try to save some of them and keep them from being torn down by people that, frankly, don't really know what they have on their hands?
I'll go ahead and start, and I'll try and keep it quick. The main point, something I've learned, and George, you've said this time and time again, by the time there's an interest or there's movement to demolish a building, it's probably too late. The best way to get people, or to preserve these buildings and keep them around for posterity, is to draw attention to them now. That's sort of what we do with the projects that I have: write stories and articles and share photos and give people a connection to the building while it's still being used. Awareness, appreciation, knowledge, all that goes a long way. And perhaps the other key factor, more important fact, is keeping it occupied. I think it was you, George, that said that the enemy of modernist architecture wasn't evil developers, but vacancy. And so it's really a matter of making the public aware of how unique and special these buildings are, keep letting people appreciate them, have them occupied, and that way they can live on.
Milton?
Well, I guess some of the things that cause them to disappear are the land value becomes so high, and you can build so much more and get so much more income out of that particular space. That's what happens, and unless some group or some sugar daddies are willing to come in and purchase these buildings and actually, make them operate and use them as they are and keep them going, they're all going to go away.
And that's particularly true.
We used to joke back in the 60s, we're building for 40 or 50 years. That's here. And a lot of buildings, some of them need to be torn down after 40 or 50 years. But it's a market-driven economy, unfortunately.
So we had on our show, our first show, Myrick Howard with Preservation North Carolina, who talked about preservation easements, particularly for houses. Preservation easements are like a homeowners association of one, where you can put protections on your building. And that's a feature that commercial owners can use if they want to as well. If they're interested in preserving the building for the future, they can put restrictions on it in the sale, which may limit how many people they could sell it to, but will assure the building moves on forward into time. And there are more and more preservation easements being used on commercial buildings throughout the country. I guess I'd like to know from both you and John Milton, if I'm somebody who's in Indiana or South Carolina or Idaho or California, and I've got a modest community and we've got 10 mid-century modernist buildings. I mean, how can I go about organizing so by the time that the bulldozers are at the door, I can maybe have prevented one or two of them from going away?
One thing that can be done at the municipal level is having some sort of landmarks ordinance or some sort of system to where if a building is deemed as culturally important or culturally unique to the community, that there's a hearing, and here in Chicago it's known as the Demolition Delay Ordinance. Sometime back in the late 70s, early 80s, they took a catalog of all the buildings in the city and rated them according to how unique they were, and a variety of factors, and Classic gave them color codes. And if a building with a specific color code if someone applied for a demolition permit, they would have to go through a review process and jump through some hurdles and spend a little bit more money than they would if it was just some other average nondescript building. So to answer your question, it's certainly not easy, but something that maybe I'll do is work with the legislative process in municipal regions and try and get a process in place that gets cities to recognize them and make it a little bit more difficult to demolish the particularly important and particularly unique houses and buildings in an area.
And of course, you can also organize tours. We've found that one of the best ways to get the public behind you is to get them in the buildings that they may have driven by for 20 or 30 years and never stepped inside. They've
Absolutely.
Just kind of wondered what that building is like, or maybe it's something they think they would never go inside. But if you get them in there, you find you get a lot of converts to help save it.
That's absolutely true. It's something I found with Goodnight Raleigh a lot of the time. So there were so many comments and so many people in person that would say, I walked by that building, or I drove by that building so many times, and I thought it was ugly, or I thought it was, I just thought it was boring, or nothing was particularly special about it. But if people can just stop for a minute and open their eyes and appreciate it, just like you said, it really changes a lot of minds. People sort of notice the new whenever there's a new building or new construction that goes up, but something that's been there their whole life, it's in the periphery, and they're not in tune to it, not really inclined to appreciate it a lot of the time.
All right, John, one last question. I know you speak Russian. So how do you say in Russian?
A better way to describe it would be that I can understand listening to it. I don't practice speaking it very often, but I do study Russian, and I do study Korean as well.
Well, can you say in either Russian or Korean, less is more?
Oh, wow. Put me on the spot. I have to think about it. I know Mnogo is more in Russian, and less. I'm struggling here now that I'm being put on the spot. But
I'm sorry, man.
Since you are on the topic about less is more, one quick thing I want to say real quick is now that I've been in Chicago and I've seen a lot of Mises' work, I certainly admire it. For example, the buildings on IIT, but I have to say, I still prefer Milton Small's architecture to Mises'. I really have a lot of respect for what he did, and I think in a lot of ways Milton surpassed his former teacher in creating buildings.
Well, that's because he transferred the ideas to the South.
I think you might be onto something there.
Well, thank you both for being on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed talking to you all today.
All right. US Modernist Radio is sponsored by Sarah Sonk, the real estate agent who loves modernist houses just as much as you do. 919-601-7339. And by modboxusa.com and their swanky, colorful, stylish, retro, mid-century modern mailboxes. Thanks for listening. I'm George Smart with Frank King. Take us out, Tom.
Visit US Modernist Radio on the web at usmodernistradio.org for links about people and buildings mentioned today on the show. US Modernist Radio is recorded at Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Meanwhile, follow us on Twitter at US Modernist or email us at comments@usmodernistradio.org. US Modernist Radio is a production of North Carolina Modernist Houses, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and Frank and I will be back in 2 weeks for another cantilevered, floor-to-ceiling, less is more, concrete and steel edition of US Modernist Radio.